Wait, let's have a class-wide some ball session.
All right, welcome back, everyone. Hope you had a nice lunch. So I thought for a good final lecture, we will recap the entire course and go through all the lectures and see how much we've learned thus far. So here we go. So welcome to boot camp. We can skip this one.
Yes. Well done.
Yeah. All right, lecture 0, diving into JavaScript. So we're all JavaScript masters now. So we know that JavaScript is interpreted, right? We know the syntax very well. Yeah, remember, this is the stuff we were learning on the first day, and you guys are like, oh, I don't get it. But now look at you. All right, types. Who can tell me what the types are? Number, object,
String.
undefined, string, null, Boolean.
And the one we didn't have no symbol.
Symbol is new in ES7. That was all of them, right? Yeah, good job, guys. Typecasting, coercion, what does that mean? Yeah.
You can like make one type turn into another one by
Yeah.
putting little things in front of it.
Exactly, turning one type into another one. And so we have explicit and implicit. And then what's the difference between 2 and 3? Triple, equal, double, triple, equal? Yeah, and so which one should we use? Triple. Why? Because this. So more coercion. Which values are falsy? Can anybody name all of them? All right, just start calling them out then.
Null.
Null,
Undefined.
undefined,
Zero.
0, empty string. No. No.
No.
Yeah, plus and minus 0 both. And not a number. Which values are truthy? That includes everything else, including empty object, empty array. Objects, functions, array. Objects, arrays, functions, objects. What was my little joke here?
Object.
Yeah, they're all objects, right? And so what is prototypical?
Didn't see that one.
What's prototypical inheritance? What's prototypical inheritance?
It comes with every single instance of that object.
Yeah, exactly. So non-primitive types have methods, and every object stores a reference to that prototype, which we can then call. And so this is, what am I saying here? What's the code example that's going to pop up? So I'm saying non-primitive, so primitive types don't have like these special methods, and so we can cast them explicitly like this. And so the code example I showed was 42.toString doesn't work because 42 is just a normal number. It's a primitive type. But JavaScript will automatically box them up and assume that you want to use these methods that would be on their what's called object wrappers. And so what are the answers to this question? What's the reference? Why use the reference to the prototype? Tiff, you answered it last time. Can you remember what you said 2 weeks ago?
I think it's because like you don't want to like change the prototype that's like hard coded in the system or whatever.
Not quite. So what's the advantage of using a reference to the prototype rather than creating a new method every object that you create? Yeah, it's less memory. So alternative is what I said. You can just create a whole new object, including all the methods and properties with every single object that you create. And so that would be memory inefficient. And then what's the danger of keeping a reference to a prototype? Exactly. If you change that prototype, it changes for every instance of that object. Scope. So what's the variable lifetime?
Till the end of the function.
Yeah, from when it's created till the end of the function. What is hoisting? Yeah, so functions you define at the bottom are still valid at the top, but not variable initializations. How does that work? Because the engine will read through everything, check your stuff for syntax errors. It will then read the function definitions into memory and allow you to call when it starts to read through the second time to actually execute. What is this global object? exactly what it says, yeah. So what are some differences between the global and window objects now? Now that we've used both Node and front end, can anybody name some differences between the browser's global object and Node.js's global object? We gave one example earlier today. It's written on the board if you don't remember. Right, fetch. Fetch is something you can use in a browser, but you can't use on the back end. What's one other thing? Anyone? Can anyone think of one? Is there any HTML on the back end? No. So there are some methods that allow you to manipulate HTML or manipulate the DOM, like document.createElement. So that's something you'll only find in the browser, but not on the back end. All right, execution context. Anybody remember what that is? Every time you execute a function, what? Yeah, it's like a namespace for a function. You can think of it like that. So it's like a stack frame in C. So it's a wrapper of all the variables and functions local to a function's execution. Lexical environment. Do you guys remember this stuff? This was the difficult stuff. So how a variable resolves depends on where it is actually defined in your code. And this gives us what powerful JavaScript concept does this lexical environment kind of unlock? A closure, exactly. And so let's talk about some advanced JavaScript. Primitives versus objects. Primitives are immutable, objects are not. And so we had a demo here. And so what's the difference between passing by reference and value? Anyone? Exactly. So passing by value, you create a copy. So you pass the copy. Whereas passing by reference, if you're thinking in terms of C, it's like passing a pointer. And so if you change any of those variables, then it actually changes the global object or whatever the parent scoped object is. This, does anybody remember this? We used it a little bit in front end. What is it?
Like when you call a method, it's the thing that's attached to the thing right before the period.
Exactly. So when you call a method with a period, it's that object right before the period. In other words, it's the object that invokes the method, that the method is invoked on. In the global object, or in the global execution context, it's the global object. How do we set this manually? 3 ways. Call, bind, and apply. First class functions, what is that referring to?
Callback.
It allows us to use callbacks, yeah. We can assign functions to variables, yeah, that's part of it. Yeah.
Functions can be taken as arguments.
Yeah, this is all part of it. Functions can be taken as arguments. But it's that functions are actually treated in the same way as objects, which allows us to pass them into functions. It allows us to create callbacks, stuff like that. What's the higher order function? Does anybody remember that?
A function called another function.
Close. Yeah, it's a function that returns another function or that gets passed another function in. And so map, filter, and reduce were the ones that we played with. Synchronous, async, single-threaded, which of these is JavaScript? Yeah, it's synchronous and single-threaded, but we are allowed to use asynchronous calls like fetch or any of these other things. And so these are some examples of those asynchronous calls. Actually, does anybody remember when we talked about the execution stack, browser APIs, function queue, event loop? What are those keywords referring to? Yeah.
How it handles asynchronous calls, which is anything like a disk read or write or a database query or something like that.
Yeah.
Well, using callbacks.
Exactly. So it's how it handles all these asynchronous calls. So we have the normal execution stack, which is handled synchronously. We have any browser APIs or external APIs that we can call. We have a function queue, which is where all the callbacks kind of queue up ready to go, and the event loop, which will check that function queue every time the execution stack is empty and bring those callbacks into the main execution stack. So it's not just browser APIs in the second dot now, it's now stuff like database queries and stuff like that, anything asynchronous. And so here are some examples of asynchronous functions. We have set timeout, which we use, XHR requests, which we use through fetch, and database calls. Callbacks are what? You're all callback masters now. What are they? Yeah, it's code that an asynchronous function will call once it's done running. What's a promise? What problem does a promise solve? Jeff, was that a? Yeah, it solves callback hell. And what does a promise actually do? What other advantages do we have? Some I don't actually have on this slide. We saw one great example earlier today and yesterday. Yeah, promise.all allows us to do multiple async things at once and then call a callback function or a then clause as soon as all of them return. Closures, everybody's favorite. Can anybody talk me through a closure real quick? You want to take a shot?
There's like a function within a function, then once the parent function returns and the variables still have the same values as they were declared in the parent function.
Exactly. So it's the effect where a child has access to its parent function's scope even after that parent function has returned. What's an IFI? And how does it help us?
It deals with the problem of closure.
Yeah, so it solves closures. How?
Instead of you immediately sub in like the value, and instead of using the whatever the variable is after the parent function is done.
Exactly. So you create your own new execution stack, which creates a new closure, and then immediately execute that function. Great. Well, that's all of advanced JavaScript. And now everybody's real favorite, Git. So what is Git? Yeah, right. Oh, so stupid. It's a great version control system. We know this. We know this. Relevant commands. What are some commands that we know? Git pull, git status,
Checkout.
git push, git checkout, git stash. We didn't even talk about. Yeah.
Reset hard.
Commit, git reset hard. Yeah, these are all commands. Git init will create one. Git clone does what? Yeah, copies a new repo from a URL. Status gives you the status. Git add. Why is it important to run a git add before git commit? Yes, otherwise it won't add anything to that commit. So you need to manually tell Git what to track. Git reset. The destroyer, yeah. So without any arguments, it just undoes a git add. But if you start to pass it arguments, you can consider the destroyer git reset hard will force the head to a different commit and wipe out all the other changes. Git commit, we all know git commit. What does it do? It commits, thank you. It creates like a checkpoint. Git log. Has anybody actually run git log? A couple times? Yeah, so you can actually see your old changes, see any messages that you left yourself. Git pull. What's a byproduct of git pull? Merge conflicts. Caused by failed auto merge. We're all masters at fixing merge conflicts now. Git push. Has anybody run a git push? We all did today, right? So it might have been your first git push today. So it's sending code upstream rather than pulling. Git branch. Has anybody branched? So I would say definitely try branching. It's one of the more powerful tools of Git, and it allows you to create like alternate realities. That way you have one path to create a new feature, and maybe you don't want to use that feature and you can just delete that branch. Or maybe you'll finish one feature but not another one, so you can merge that one into master and push that to production. And so this allows you to create alternate realities, which you can merge together if you want, delete, do some testing. And so you saw me use git branch a little bit for Heroku. That way I was sure not to push that up to GitHub. Git checkout, has anybody run git checkout? A little bit? So it allows you to go see old code, or see code, new code too, see code on a different branch.
How do you jump, once you check out, how do you jump back to the head again?
So,
Point the head.
yeah, so how do you get back to your current state, your old current state, after checking out something? You can run git checkout master, where master is the default name of your first branch. And so by saying git checkout master, that says go check out the latest commit in your main branch. Git merge. Has anybody run a git merge? Yeah, you should all be nodding your heads because git pull actually does a git merge. And that's all the git we learned. But some of you ran stuff like git fetch a little bit, maybe git stash, explored other things. All right. Then we started learning Node. So what's module exports? It's an object, yeah. That gets exported, which how do we then import that? Require. What are node module? Yeah.
The difference between the exports again is it the exports is the thing that's module that exports is the item itself, and exports is pointing at the same thing, but exports only exists after you assign something to module that exports.
So at the beginning, module.exports and exports are both pointing at the same object. Because if you remember, all objects are pointed to by reference, but only module.exports is what actually gets exported. So if you're tacking stuff on, that's fine because they're pointing to the same object. But if you actually point one of them to a different object, then only module.exports is going to actually get exported. Does that make sense?
Only one if they're both pointing at one object.
Yeah, so at the beginning, they're both pointing to the same object. They're both referencing the same object. And so if you're doing stuff like exports dot something equals something, that's like tacking on properties to that object. And so if you do that, that's perfectly fine. But if you do something like exports equals new object literal, then now that exports is going to be pointing at a different object. And so what actually gets exported is module.exports. And so you have to make sure that at the end of your script, module.exports is still pointing to whatever you want it to actually export. Make sense? Node modules are what? Have we used any node modules? What are some examples? Express, yeah, Express. We've definitely used that one. Bcrypt. Huh?
Is Mongoose?
Mongoose, yeah.
Is Grunt?
Grunt, yeah. Tons of them, right? There are a lot of them. We used a lot of them. How do we install them? With npm install. npm. What is package.json? It keeps dependencies. It keeps track of scripts,
Other metadata?
other metadata. So it's like a configuration file for your application. So it keeps track of stuff like name, version, author, or scripts, or dependencies. What are some npm commands? They're built into the scripts, whatever one we run. So npm install, we'll install. npm run, what are some examples of ones that we've written? Dev, start, build, whatever you want to define. Express, what is express? Can anybody give me a short definition of express?
Makes web apps.
Makes web apps. Yeah, that's a very short and very accurate description. It's a minimalist web application framework. You nailed it. Very similar to Flask and Python. Very powerful routing system. We've explored that in depth. Express routing. So we all know app.get, app.post, app.delete. All right, what's rec, res, and next? In more detail than I've written on here.
Like objects that you can tag properties onto that are like involve like the request and like response from functions.
Exactly. So request and response are two objects that you can tack methods onto or tack additional properties onto, and then response will eventually send a response. And what is next? What type is next? A function. What does it do?
Middleware.
Yeah, it just says, all right, go execute that next middleware. And that is that lecture. All right, middleware and REST. Express middleware does what? Anything, whatever you want it to do, right? You can create your own middleware functions, and they all have access to three things: the request, response, and next. And they can all listen at any path and execute some sort of function. Yeah?
This is sort of separate, but if we were to have used, I mean, if we were to switch over to using like Django or Flask or something like this, does first of all, does all this sort of structure, like structure middleware, stay the same in routing and that sort of thing? And then second, this is even more removed, but how common is that using this sort of like dual server reverse proxy structure?
Okay, so the first question is, if we are to use different frameworks like Django and Flask, do these concepts carry over? So I've never actually used Django. I've looked at it once, and Flask I've only minimally used. So I can't really answer that in depth, but from what I've looked at, it's slightly different. They don't have chains of middleware. It's just one function that runs at a certain endpoint, at the best of my knowledge. Second question was, what about that API and front-end structure that we've been working with? How common is that? Extremely common. So like Google has an API, and they also have a front-end. And their front-end, I'm sure, is using their API. I don't know. I've never seen Google source code. But from what it seems like they set it up that way. Same with Facebook or a lot of these other companies. Yeah, so what happens if we don't send a response? It'll hang. What kind of types of middleware are there? Can anybody name them? There are 4.
Express app.
Express app middleware, app level, error handlers, router, and then built in. Yeah, exactly. Got them all. RESTful services. So what is REST?
An acronym.
It's an acronym, thank you. It's also a word, yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's an API design paradigm. Nailing it today. Can anybody remember all of the constraints?
Stateless.
Stateless is one of them, yeah.
Cacheable.
It's cacheable, yeah. Is that
Client server.
client server? Yeah, okay.
Simple and
Simple and scalable.
Descriptive messages.
Yeah, I mean, you got almost all of them. Stateless, we all know what stateless means, right? So in order for something to be stateless, everything that you need to be able to respond needs to be included in that request. So there's no other background knowledge about any user. So having tokens and being able to identify a user based on a token, is that stateful or stateless? Stateless. What about having a function which relies on another function to authenticate a user, authorize a user? Is that still stateless? Yeah, because it's all self-contained information within that request via that token. Descriptive messages just needs to tell them what they should do with that response. Consistent resource identifiers means like how should we structure these things? What should they look like?
What do you mean descriptive messages besides like not commenting your code?
So it's nothing to do with like the code being commented. It's like, here's JSON and here's like what you should do with that JSON.
Meaning like the
Meaning-
JSON object is clear.
Yeah, I'm telling you that it's JSON and here comes some JSON.
Okay.
stuff like that. So consistent resource identifiers, like how do we organize our endpoint? It should be an action and an object. Client server means the client should be running, and they should ask the server for stuff, and all the server should do is receive requests and send out responses. Cacheable, some sort of identifier on their version. And that's the next lecture. All right, and then we began work on our API, the Crimson Coupon app. So these were two things we worked on. And how do we plan the API? What are some questions we might ask ourselves? Yeah, we should just plan everything first, hit a whiteboard. What are some important decisions we should make? What kinds of objects should we use?
Kind of relationships between.
Yeah, what are the relationships between them? How do we organize everything? What data should we use? What functionality are we looking for? What are some difficulties? And then that's when we hit the whiteboard and we figured out exactly what we were going to do. Other considerations, keep looking forward. And then we talked about databases. So what does a database do? Stores data. What else?
Allows us to access it.
Yeah, looks up that data, gives it back to us. What does CRUD mean?
Read, update, delete.
Exactly. And what are the two big types of databases that we looked at?
Relational and document.
Exactly. What's an ORM? What's an ODM?
Object relational mapping.
And so it allows us to represent the data as objects, which fits better within our object-oriented approach. And so there's a couple examples of how to insert one via straight SQL, and second using an ORM called SQLize. So we had a little hash out about what these things are, and what are some advantages of relational databases. Yeah, so we can join tables. Complex queries using what language? SQL. Great for analytics because we can join things on arbitrary functions. And lastly, forced integrity of data, which we don't get in a document-based. Unless what happens? Unless we do what? Which?
Authentication.
Authentication? Is that a word?
Is that actually not a word?
I don't think so.
Authentication.
So what did we use to force, what did we do to enforce integrity of our MongoDB data?
Error handling.
We check things, yeah. We defined a schema. So we use Mongoose. Mongoose forces integrity of data onto our MongoDB database. So what are some advantages of document-based databases? Flexible, cheap. You don't need to know SQL. This should be easier. You've been using document-based.
You just throw it.
Cheap as in inexpensive. It can run on any hardware. Whereas with SQL, you probably need a beefier processor because the queries get more complex. It's fast. You don't have to do any joining. Simple. And then, of course, you have objects, you have arrays, and more higher dimensional data types. All right, which is better? What do we vote for? Document-based? Oh, we played with these, yeah. What about the big data? What should they use? Relational, startup, document-based. Lots of data, they don't want to spend money. Document-based. We're a bank and data integrity is crucial. Relational, a beginner. Probably that. Document-based. What should we use? We decided to use MongoDB for these reasons. We looked into Mongoose, which is what? What is Mongoose? It's a node module, yeah. It's also another acronym we looked at earlier. It's an ODM, yeah. It allows us to create schemas for that data integrity. We had that validation. We defined methods, like what's an example of a method we defined? Compare password on the user, exactly. We can write hooks. What hook did we write? A pre-save hook for validation, yeah. And then we coded. Oh, and then there's room change.
Oh no. Let's actually go there.
Next day, we just coded together. Then we moved to the front end. So it's MV. So what's MVC? Model View Controller, which means what? So what does MVC mean? Yeah, it stands for Model View Controller, but what does it mean?
So like make sure we, yeah.
It's how you stay organized, yeah. So keep 3 parts. What's a model?
Like configurations, like
Configuration stuff. Our database, metadata. So any data. What about views? HTML stuff, templates, Pug, yeah. What about C? Yeah, logic. Stuff that converts what a user does into some logic. And so we talked about some tools. What are templating engines? Pug. Not yet. Stylus is another one. What do they actually do? Yeah, let's just use basic logic in HTML. Speeds up our development process. What about CSS preprocessors? What does that allow us to do? Yeah, it helps us style a page. Or we could do it with basic CSS. What does a preprocessor do? What preprocessor did we use? Stylus. Did anybody use any of the benefits? No? Yeah, so it simplifies the process. We don't have to write curly braces and all that stuff. We have basic logic. We can create variables, if-else statements, loops, math. We can import other Stylus code. All right, JavaScript libraries. What are some examples? jQuery. Not Angular. Angular's a framework. But jQuery is definitely the main one. There are a few others. Underscore D3 moment. What do they do? What's the difference between a framework and a library? Can anybody? Exactly. Inversion of control. So you call the library's methods, and then for framework, it calls your code. All right, why shouldn't, what are some disadvantages to libraries and frameworks? Slower. You gotta learn it, yeah. It's less customizable, yeah. It takes up space, so bandwidth. Exactly, that's pretty much all of it. We checked out a speed comparison where JavaScript would run 12 million operations and jQuery only ran 350,000. It got even worse down here. Task runners. What is a task runner? Yeah, exactly. It runs tasks for us. What did we use? Grunt.
Why do all these packets have such weird names?
I don't know. I've never used broccoli or cake.
Like Webpack makes sense.
Webpack makes sense, yeah. Gulp is cool. They have a nice logo. Grunt has a cool logo. Express on the front end. So then we talked about some differences between Express on the back end and on the front end. What are some of them? Can anybody name a few? What are two functions you won't see on the back end that you will see on the front end? Not necessarily request, because your back end might make requests. Fetch you're not using within Express, so that's in the browser.
To set up the templating engines.
Yeah, so templating engine stuff for sure. So res.render you won't see on the back end. What's one other thing? Did we have a public folder on our back end? No, so how did we get that public folder to be public? Yeah, express.static. And so what stack did we use? All this stuff. So it wasn't quite mean stack, it was more like men stack. It was more like me stack, because we didn't use Nginx either. But mean stack is MongoDB, Express, which we use both, then AngularJS, which is a library or a framework, and then Nginx, which is like a reverse proxy.
Is it a very common?
Yeah, so that's a very, very common stack. All right, and then we talked about front-end JavaScript. So why did we use JavaScript on websites? Browsers understand it. Why we could have written websites without JavaScript on the front end. What benefits did we get by using JavaScript?
Interactive, or it changes without having to.
Interactive. It changes without having to refresh the page, which is what?
Dynamic.
Dynamic, yeah.
Dynamism is the word
Dynamism
you
is the word I used. Ooh. We also had DOM manipulation, which made things dynamic. We could respond to users' inputs, fetch information without reloading the page is the big one, and we can even run things while offline. Also, we can store information for later use. How do we do that? How do we store information? A cookie is one way.
Local storage.
Local storage is the other way. Yeah.
Can you recap like without reloading the page? Is that always because whether it's XHR or like jQuery.ajax or anything, it's just because it's going around the reverse proxy server?
Not necessarily because we're using a reverse proxy. So fetching information without reloading a page is just the ability to send a network request without having to visit a new page on the browser. And so that is fetch.
But isn't that because like you're circumventing the front-end server?
Not because we can submit a request to anywhere. Like we could simulate a redirect without actually redirecting. So what if I did something like, so I'm on this page right now. It's a blank page. I'm going to open up a console. And I can do something like fetch some website, HTTP colon. So fetch this website. And then in the .then take the response and extract the text out of it. And then when that's done, take that response and update the document.body.
Is text referred to the HTML?
Yeah. So take the document.body.inner.html and make that equal to the result. So let me try a different. I can do a catch, but I don't really care about the error. So let me try a different page. So why am I having trouble thinking of a page that I can use? Why can't I just throw any page in here?
It have to be HTTPS.
Oh, that's so. Let me visit a page that's not HTTPS, like the bootcamp website. And then rerun this. And it just refreshed it replaced everything on the page, but I'm still on the bootcamp page. Does that make sense? So I fetched information without actually reloading the page. So we're kind of making our own SPA here. Remember that SPA keyword? And so we're still on the bootcamp page. If we refresh the page, it's the bootcamp page. But what I did is I sent an asynchronous request using fetch, used that request, and used the response, which was actually HTML, and replaced the body's HTML with that HTML. And so that is an example of an asynchronous call. It's asynchronous in that this page was still running when we sent the request out to the other domain. And then when it came back, we decided via promise, hey, let's extract that text and update the current page's body to be that. Does that make sense? Cool. Yeah. So we were... So then lots of applications of front-end JavaScript, including validation, autocomplete, animation, alert confirm pop-ups. We only really looked at form validation in depth and form submission. And so what is AJAX? Asynchronous JavaScript and XML, but what does that do? What does it give us?
It's asynchronous calls, so you don't have to like refresh the page.
Yeah, so we can make network calls without refreshing the page, which can be form submission. It can be getting information. It can be all sorts of anything you want. And we used it to submit requests from our front end to our back end. How do we use it? What is the function we used? Fetch. What's a promise? We talked about it earlier. How do we use it? We talked about that earlier. And so this is an example of us using it. And that was the end of that day. So now we are off to CSS. CSS, something we didn't dive super in depth into, but we talked about some strategies. Everybody clear on what CSS is? What are the three ways to declare CSS? Inline, in the head, and external. Exactly. And then I quoted myself. All right, CSS frameworks. What are some examples of CSS frameworks that you've heard of? Stylus isn't a framework. It's actually just a preprocessor. But Bootstrap's probably the most famous one. There are a ton of them. Toast is a very lightweight one. Yeah, broccoli cake. So they give you goodies like grids, responsive design, icons, nav bars. And then you don't really have to worry about designing pages because there are templates built in. You can just call those templates. What are some trade-offs? Not customizable, a lot of memory, and then just a lot of network requests back and forth. What's the box model? So there's content, there's margin, there's padding, and there's border. In what order? Content's in the middle, then some padding, then border, then margin. Yeah, exactly. What was this box sizing border box thing? Exactly. So when we set width, it accounts for the border, padding, and content, but not the margin. What is Flexbox? It's the sickest invention. It's awesome. Yeah, so it's like smart CSS. It will style a page kind of for you. You have to give it some information, but it will figure out where things should be all laid out. So where do we start? Same thing. Hit the whiteboard. What's mobile first design? Yeah, make it fit on the phone first. Keep it super simple first, and then add functionality for larger screens. What's responsive design?
Works on other computer or mobile.
Yeah, that's part of it.
Like it can like resize itself.
Exactly. So pages should be laid out based on the window size. And so how do we achieve responsive design? Using percentages rather than absolute. Media queries is a huge one. And then Flexbox helps as well. Did anybody actually read the Viewport article? No? Well, you should. You should. We'll read it after this. Staying organized. Does anybody remember what design, the organization method we talked about? Yeah, BEM, exactly. So block element modifier. And so it's a convention where block parent level elements get normal names like a button. Then what are modifiers? So what are modifiers? They kind of build off that parent. And so button will define the button. The modifiers will build off that button, like change the color, make it slightly wider, make it inline, stuff like that. And they're designated by a double dash, so button red or button inline. And things within that parent are called elements. And those get double underscores. So within that button, like the button underscore underscore text or something like that. And so this, you don't have to use the system. It exists, is popular. But just keep things maintainable and organized. And then we practiced. Then we talked about miscellaneous front-end stuff. What's cores? Anybody remember? Cross, origin, request, script system. Cross-origin resource sharing. We were close. We had half of it. And what does this mean? What does it do? Does anybody remember?
It's like browsers by default don't let you like just randomly reference or pull things from other sites, and you have to like have special permissions for it or something.
Exactly. So by default, browsers used to block all cross-origin requests that originated from scripts. Why?
Pop-ups that like kept coming out.
Yeah, so back in the day, people were really spammy with their JavaScript. There'd be pop-ups galore, and they would also make requests galore. And so cores allows some of these to be made. And so there's a kind of order of things where the server that receives the request must say, hey, I'm going to allow this request to come through. How do they do that? Well, they set this thing in the header. Everybody knows what headers are now. This thing called access control allow origin, that's the name of the header. And they say star, meaning allow it from all other origins. And so there's a pre-flight request that's made that says, hey, are you going to accept this request? They'll say, yeah, go ahead via this header. And then that request will actually be sent.
When's a cross-origin request that we were making? We didn't actually ever have to invoke that, did we?
So there was a bug the day before this where we tried to hit our backend directly from our front end. And it wouldn't let us because our backend didn't send this header. And so that's part of why we're using the reverse proxy.
Which request or what call?
So if I tried to do something like so this is now running at localhost 3000. If I tried to make a request to localhost 3000 via the browser, so first go to non-HTTPS page and try to fetch $3,000. Then it says fetch API cannot load it because no access control out origin header is present on this. Blah, blah, blah. To fetch the resource with CORS disabled. And so it's blocking it because of this CORS. So we didn't actually set this access control allow origin. Therefore, it didn't, the browser blocked it.
How do we set that?
You would do res.setHeader access control allow origin equal to star, which means allow it from everywhere.
And how do we get past this?
Yeah, how does our front end communicate with the back end like this?
So the reason our front end could communicate with the back end is because the front end sent it to its own server, and then since the front end communicated with the back end via like request, which is outside the browser is what's actually blocking this, not HTTP or not like the internet.
So that's why we can communicate with Postman or something.
Yeah, that's why Postman allows this as well, because Postman's not originating from a script. It has to originate from a script, which is what we're writing down here. What happens if we don't have access to the server? That's why we created our reverse proxy. Does everybody remember what a reverse proxy is? Anybody want to take a shot at talking us through it? Jeremy?
It's a server that hides like another server from the client.
Yeah, so
So it will like serve up or like carry out or deliver some request to a client that they may actually be cutting from another resource.
exactly. So that server might ask another resource and serve it up as if it was its own resource. Exactly. And you can do it using Nginx or Express as we've seen. Cool. Then we talked about authentication. What is authentication?
Like affirming whether a user is who they say they are.
Yeah, seeing if a user is actually who they say they are. It's followed by authorization, which is actually what determines if they have the correct permissions. What are some authentication methods? Tokens. Cookies. Headers is a way to implement tokens and cookies. Close. HTTP basic, I think, is what you're thinking of. And what's HTTP basic? Does anybody remember? It's where you just stick a username and password in the header. So that's very insecure. Anybody who sees that can steal your username and password. You can't log out. There are cookies, which created sessions that are stored on the server, so that's stateful and memory wasting. And there's tokens, which we used. So we know about token stuff. What are the benefits? Stateless. Is that the only benefit?
It's like one thing you compare as opposed to like different fields within a user.
Yeah, it's easy to identify. It carries information too. And then we can use it with web and local and mobile. And so what's a JWT, a JOT? JSON web token. Yes. What does it do? What does it look like? How do we use it?
It's like 3 parts.
There are 3 parts to it:
Header,
header, payload, and signature.
secret.
What does it do?
It's like bit 64 encoded, so
It's base 64 encoded.
Like the information that we need.
Yeah, so it doesn't encrypt
Or it's just like
because it's just you can
can't see it
easily
correctly, yeah.
translate it.
It's hashing.
It's hashable. What benefits does it give us? Who can sign the token? Or who can generate the token?
Only someone with the secret.
Only somebody with the secret. And so who can decode the token? Or make sure that that token is valid? Also the only person with the secret. So it allows us to use auth tokens. How do we use it? Well, what are the 3 ways we can send it to our server?
Header.
Header, URL, and body. Preferred way is header, because of these reasons, and then we started using them. Then we talked about adding packages. I think this was like a 2-slide lecture. So how do we add packages to an Express server? We require them in. What do we have to do before requiring them in? NPM installing them. Oh, and then we talked about promises. And we looked at promise to all, which we talked about earlier today. And then we used, what did we use for sending emails?
Node mailer.
Node mailer. Lecture 13, front-end authentication. How would we use JOTS in the front end?
Well, we used it for auth token to like verify whether someone was logged in.
Yes, we stored it and used it to see if somebody was logged in. How did we store it? Within local storage. This was a tough day. So we need to send the token with every request. So we need to store it. We talked about how we would store it. What were the benefits of using it as a cookie? So that's on the server side. So we're talking about front-end side. So as a front-end engineer, what's the benefit of using a cookie?
Probably makes for a lot more office jokes, I guess.
It makes people hungrier. Yeah, but so it's automatically sent with every request. We don't have to worry about including it. What are some downsides? Well, there isn't a lot of memory to use because cookies are only 4 kilobytes large. What's another downside? Well, it sends with every request automatically. That's both a plus and a minus. It's not necessarily accessible by JavaScript. That's both a plus and a minus as well. And it only stores string. Same with local storage, though. And so before we talk about other things, let's talk about HTML5 storage. What are the 2 types of HTML5 storage? Local storage, session storage. And what were the benefits here? You can store a lot more. 5 megabytes for Chrome and Firefox, Safari, 10 megabytes for Internet Explorer, which is like 1,000 times more than a cookie. is only accessible via JavaScript from the same page, the same domain. And then we talked about some hacks. So I was saying that a bad thing about cookies is that they're sent with every request automatically. Why might that be a bad thing? Yeah, so it's already authenticated. And if they visit some URL, especially a state-changing one, that state will immediately change, even if they didn't mean to visit that URL. And so that hack is called cross-site request forgery, which is where I might get somebody to visit a link that's changed the state, like this one where it will transfer an amount of $10,000 to me, and by sending you an email and hiding it in the email, or putting it within an image tag where it will automatically get that, or by having a self-sending form that will submit a post request. So any social engineering that gets you to execute a request, and then your cookie will automatically be sent. What's the other hack that we talked about? XSS, which stands for what? Cross-site scripting, exactly. And so that's the process where you inject bad JavaScript into the site, which then gets served to all of their users. How might I go about doing that? Within comments, that gets shared. Exactly. What did we decide on? Local storage. Because of these reasons. And then for the last lecture, we talked about finishing front end, so we tied up all loose knots. Rise of the SPA. What's a SPA? Single page app. And it's just what I demoed quickly earlier, where there's one skeleton that gets loaded, and then using AJAX, so asynchronous requests, the page dynamically updates. And so frameworks like Angular, Ember, Meteor implement this. And so most of the logic, most of the processing is moved to the client side. We talked briefly about DOM manipulation. What are some DOM manipulation calls? How do you create an element? Document.createElement. How do you modify? What are some calls to modify a DOM element? Inner HTML. Append child. What are some other ones? Set attribute. Remove child. And used in conjunction with fetch, we can actually create our own SPAs. We looked at it briefly. We didn't actually implement that. But if you're interested, go look at the solution of dorm supplies, because I did it in there. Then we talked about fetch. And then we implemented some stuff. And that was the entire course. So we covered a whole buttload of material. We recovered a whole buttload of material in an hour. But just remember, like 9 days ago, what is this, day 7, 8 days ago, you were struggling with JavaScript syntax, and now you're creating entire websites using AJAX. So big step in the last 8 days. So good job, guys. Yeah.
Are there any advantages of non-spas over spas?
Advantages of SPAs is that parts of the page can load at a time. So say you have a bunch of things that you want loaded. If you're doing it all like via what's called server-side templating, which is what we're doing with Pug, all of that data has to be loaded before it even starts sending the page. But with SPAs, you open the skeleton, then you can start loading different parts of the page at a time. So say you have a massive article that you want to read. With something dynamic, you can load the shell, load the first paragraph. The client can start reading the first paragraph, and then you can load the subsequent paragraphs as they go. Whereas with server-side templating, it would actually have to load that entire article first on the server, and then send that whole article, which may take a lot more time. Any questions, loose ends that need to be tied up? Yeah.
Could you clarify the difference between stateless and stateful again?
Yeah, so the difference between stateless and stateful is that in one, you can think of the server as somebody who knows everything, and you come to them asking a question. And so If you came to me asking a question like what's 7 plus 7, I could respond 14. If you came to me asking a question, yo, what did I do yesterday? I would say, hey, I have no context outside of what you asked me, so I can't answer that question. And so with stateful, if something is stateful, they have some sort of context for each user. They remember what the user's done previously or something like that. Whereas stateless, everything that they respond for could have been looked up by what they asked. So you can think of a stateful server as a guru with a lot of memory, and then you can think of a stateless server as somebody who has like no memory of previous events. Does that help the distinction?
So what's the benefit of having stateless?
Benefit of having stateless is one that you can create REST APIs, which is better practice. You don't have to consume a lot of memory remembering past things. Any other questions? Yeah.
Do we use like multiple types of middleware in our API? Like, do we...
Yeah, so I think we used every single type of middleware. So we looked at built-in middleware like express.static. We used third-party ones like NodeMailer, Request, or any of the other ones. We used app level, which was like app.use, app.use routes. And so we used router level, that was router.route, router.get, router.post. And we used error handling, which handled our errors at the very bottom. So we used every single type of middleware. Any other questions? I thought it would be fun to wrap up the class by watching a funny video together which talks about JavaScript. So has anybody seen the WAT talk before? All right, so this is a talk on JavaScript, one of JavaScript's older versions. So not everything applies here, but I thought it was pretty funny, and let's all watch it.
All right, good. You guys know what WAT means? WAT. Exactly. Let's talk about Ruby. In Ruby, if you reference an undefined variable, of course it name errors, as you would expect. And if you try to assign B to A with them undefined, of course it name errors, as you would expect. And what happens if you try to assign A to A with A undefined? Nil. Correct. Nil. WAT. Let's talk about Ruby. Ruby, unlike some other dynamic languages, does not have bare words, so you cannot just type words in and have strings come out, unless you define a particular method missing that does the right thing. And then if you type bare words, suddenly Ruby supports bare words. And in fact, it will even support bare words with bangs in them. And this is not deserving of WAT. This is actually a result of how awesome Ruby is. But if you ever actually do this, then WAT. Let's talk about JavaScript. Does anyone know in JavaScript what array plus array is? Well, let me ask you this first. What should array plus array be? Empty array. I would also accept type error. That is not what array plus array is. Wrong. Wrong. Array plus array is empty string. Obviously, I think that's obvious to everyone. Now, what would array plus object be? This should obviously be type error because those are completely disparate types. Does anyone know what this is? No. Close. No. Far away. It's object. Right. Nicely done. Now, of course, because this is plus, so you can flip the operands and the same thing comes out. So if we do, what? No, that's just an object. If you do object plus array, you should get exactly the same thing, which, as you can see, you do. And finally, the only one of these that's actually true is, because you add arrays, you get empty string, that doesn't make sense. But an object plus an object is actually not a number, technically. So this one's actually right. And exactly, right? Like, what is even going on in this lab? I don't even understand what person with a brain in their head would think that any of this is a good idea. Okay. Enough making fun of languages that suck. Let's talk about JavaScript. if I say array.new 16, or just array 16, I get an array of 16 things, which it represents as 16 commas, which is obvious. And if I then join those with a string, then I get the string 16 times. This is actually the only line in this entire presentation that's reasonable. Now, if I take that string and then add a 1 to it, it interprets the 1 as, or casts the 1 to a string, and then we get wat1 a bunch of times. Fine. Does anyone know what will happen if I subtract 1 from the string? I'm assuming no one does. I'll give you a hint. Does this help? Does anyone know? Wet man. That's all I got. Thank you, guys.
All right, everyone, thanks for coming. This was the boot camp. That's all I have. And take the rest of the day off. Take Monday off. It's a holiday, and I'll see you on Tuesday.